lover of his in California, he always saw Smith as trying to use him in certain ways, benefiting from Glenn's celebrity at the same time that Smith was constantly putting Glenn down amongst their friends in San Francisco, putting down Glenn's intellect, appearing to admire him only for his body, or his fame. And so there's a scene at the World Series in '77 where Glenn Burke comes out to a huge ovation at Dodger Stadium, and Smith wants to take advantage of Glenn's popularity and starts speaking very loudly in seats behind home plate about the fact, that he's connected to Glenn, to the point that one of Glenn's other gay friends has to come over and tell him to shut up, that not really understanding how this could threaten Glenn's livelihood as a Major League Baseball player, or at least not caring. And so Smith is constantly pressuring Glenn to come out, and eventually succeeds in 1982. After Glenn's been run out of professional baseball, it's Smith who writes the article for Inside Sports magazine about the gay Dodger, where Glenn really comes out for the first time. And Glenn cooperated with the story, so it wasn't like he was done a raw deal by the article, but in a sense he was, because Smith was paid for the story. Glenn thought that he would be splitting the money with Michael Smith, and Smith kept all of it. And so Smith doesn't come across as a very sympathetic figure in the article. Glenn admired certain parts of Smith's character. He said that he was, it's supportive of Glenn in other ways, but it wasn't a healthy relationship. There was a lot of fighting. At one point, Smith throws all of Glenn's belongings out of their apartment onto the street in San Francisco. And so, they drift. And one reason why Smith ends up writing the article in '82 is he thought that by getting Glenn this measure of publicity, getting him back in the public eye, that Glenn might come back to him, as a couple. But that didn't happen.
All right, well, I want to come back to that article in a minute, but let's back up for a second and go back to his playing days with the Dodgers. You mentioned this really strange incident with Al Campanis, where he offers to pay for his honeymoon if he'll marry a woman, and that obviously didn't happen. Glenn Burke's feeling was that he got blackballed from the Dodgers after that. Why did he feel like that, and do you think he was right?
Well, after that, he doesn't get to play much. In '78, he's riding the pine for the early weeks of the season. He can feel that Lasorda has turned on him. I mentioned that Glenn used to joke around with Lasorda in the dugout and in the clubhouse, and Lasorda kind of played along with that, but no longer in '78 does that. In spring training, I mentioned, there's the articles about how Glenn's days are numbered with the Dodgers. So he feels like they're just looking to trade him. And eventually they do to Oakland in May of that '78 season for Billy North, who's another outfielder, another sort of fourth outfielder. And so Glenn feels, this was entirely not due to his play, but because of who he was. And Glenn's teammates backed that up. Dusty Baker and Davey Lopes both felt that way at the time. They confronted Campanis asking, why would you trade this guy? Such an integral part of the clubhouse. Sutton and Garvey are crying at their lockers when the trade is announced. Baker goes to the trainer of the Dodgers. Trainers are known for knowing everything, right? Everybody confesses to the trainer. And so he says to Buehler, the trainer, why did they trade Glenn? And he says, because he was gay. They didn't want him around. And Baker says they knew that. And he says everybody knew that. So, in terms of Glenn feeling that he was blackballed, I think there was plenty of maybe circumstantial, but plenty of evidence that was the case.
Well, you mentioned he gets traded to the A's in 1978, and then in 1979, the A's hire Billy Martin as their manager. And I think it's safe to say that probably Billy Martin is the last guy you'd want to be your manager if you're a gay man in baseball in 1979. Right. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah. Glenn thought this was a chance for a new beginning for him. He's returning home to the Bay Area. There's a number of black players on the A's at that time, like Mike Norris, that become friends with Glenn. When Billy Martin's hired, Glenn thinks that's a good thing too, because they're both alums of the same high school, Berkeley High. he initially admires the fact that Billy's kind of a scrappy fighter type of guy, a lot like him, right? But Billy knows that Glenn is gay. He tells reporters when they're out drinking in spring training that he's not going to let Glenn, quote unquote, contaminate his team, is the way he puts it. And when he is talking to members of the A's, the players, about Glenn, he calls them the F word, And so it's clear from the outset that Billy is not going to welcome a gay player on his team, even to the point it's clouding Billy Martin's judgment so much that he mistakes another player, Derek Bryant, for Glenn during a spring training game and says, "Get that F off the field," pulls Bryant from the game, sends him down to the minor leagues, and Derek Bryant never plays a major league game after that. I mean, he ruined two guys' careers because he thought that Derek Bryant was Glenn Burke. So Glenn is sent to the minor leagues after that first spring training with Billy Martin, plays for a couple of months, and is really just sort of depressed. He realizes he's never going to get called up. He's playing in the middle of Utah, which is furthest thing from the Castro, right? He's got an injured knee, and he retires from baseball. But I mean, I think that puts a little bit of an emphasis on Glenn making the decision as if it's on his own, like he's decided to retire, when really he was forced into that decision, understanding that baseball wasn't going to accept him.
You talked about this Inside Sports article, which came out in 1982, in which he reveals that he's gay. What was the public reaction to that?
Well, Glenn was hoping that there would be a big public reaction to it. He also did an interview with Bryant Gumbel to promote the article on the Today Show. And he had this hope that in coming out, it would be made more obvious to people in baseball why he wasn't playing anymore. It wasn't that he wasn't good enough in his mind. It was that he had gotten a raw deal, and that maybe someone would take a chance on him now, seeing that he was still in great shape, that he still wanted to play, that he had been run out of the game for who he was. He was hoping that there would be that potential. He was also hoping to make a little bit of money off the story. And of course, he didn't receive any of it. He also talked in the article and in the interview with Bryant Gumbel about looking to coaching as a career post-baseball, which is a pretty normal standard career for an ex-ball player. But you think about for a gay teacher or coach in the United States in the 1980s were not very great chances of that. None of the major league teams decided to look into him as a player after this article and after the Today Show interview. There wasn't even much of a backlash to it. When Dave Kopay, the football player, had come out publicly in the 1970s, his own family disowned him. There were a number of letters to the editor, to the Washington Star, saying they shouldn't have even run the article. There was essentially no reaction to Glenn's stories in the magazine or on TV. And I think a lot of that was because AIDS was arriving on the scene right at that same moment. And that became the story, especially if someone was going to devote a story to an issue that involved gay people in the United States at that time. They were only interested in covering the AIDS story. And so nothing materialized from Glenn's coming out. And in fact, his life started to deteriorate in serious ways pretty much immediately following that.
Yeah, it really is remarkable in retrospect how little reaction there was. And I read an article when I was preparing for this interview. I found an article that I think Alan Barra had written that when Jason Collins came out, Alan Barra wrote about Burke, and he wrote about the fact that in 1982, the commissioner of baseball didn't say anything. None of his, the Dodgers didn't say anything. Nobody really responded in any way, and that's why it kind of died on the vine in some ways, and people forgot about him in a lot of ways. But it really is kind of weird looking back on it, how little reaction there was.
Yeah, certainly no one was celebrating it or supporting Glenn. It's also curious that there wasn't any backlash to it either. I mean, there was no reaction, which is just sort of shocking. In that period in Glenn's life, he was really trying to figure out what was next for him. He's living in San Francisco. He's playing softball. There was a pretty highly developed gay softball league in San Francisco at that time. And in fact, when he went on the Today Show interview, he brought Brian Gumbel and presented him with a cap from his team, the Pendulum Pirates, that had won the gay softball World Series. And so he was still seeing himself first and foremost as an athlete, even if it was just as an amateur softball player. But he was considered a bit of a king in the Castro at that time. Here's a former major league player, essentially still in the prime of his career, that's there, at a time when a lot of these men have experienced just nothing but, the shunning from their former family and friends, building their own community in the Castro. And Glenn's a big part of that. And he said for a while, it was like heaven on earth, where he was accepted for who he was popular, but only enjoys that feeling for a year or two before all of a sudden his friends are sick and dying all around him. And this place that had been heaven becomes a hell on earth.
After his career ended, he suffered a gruesome leg injury. Can you tell us what happened in that incident and how he decided to cope with it?
Yeah, he was just crossing the street in the Castro and was hit by a car and was sent flying 70 feet down the road. His legs are broken badly. It's a rod inserted in one of his legs, which was only intended to be a temporary rod. It was never replaced. So eventually it starts to rot, inside his own leg. He had been introduced to cocaine as a major league player. This is during that era when coke was a pretty big deal in major league clubhouses. So he came along at just the wrong time in Major League Baseball as far as that goes, and starts to turn to drugs more heavily in response to this leg injury, to dull the pain of that. I think also to dull some of the mental anguish he was going through, having been denied his career in baseball. His friends also talked about the fact that he was having a hard time sort of adjusting to having a regular job. He had enjoyed the baseball life and enjoyed some of the celebrity that came with that. And the idea of having that denied to you, having other baseball adjacent careers denied to you, like what did he really want to do with his life, was a real problem for Glenn. He was drifting in a way. And you can imagine that mix of drifting career-wise, losing your identity as an athlete, even as a softball player when you're hit by the car, the prevalence of drugs at that time. And so he became addicted to crack and was arrested for possession, spent some time in San Quentin, and then experienced homelessness, living on the streets of San Francisco. Here's a guy that started game one of the 77 World Series, and less than a decade later is living homeless on the streets of San Francisco.
Yeah, and it's, that part of his life obviously is very tragic. And then his death, he dies at the age of, I think, 42 of AIDS in 1995. Can you talk about the final months of his life, the final years of his life? He ends up living with his sister, I believe, at the end.
Yes, that's right. So at one point, a guy named Jack McGowan, who was involved with the gay softball leagues in San Francisco, calls Sandy Alderson of the A's and says, do you know you have one of your former players who's living homeless, broke with AIDS on the streets? Alderson hadn't realized that, gets involved, has Pamela Pitts, who's in the front office with the A's, find Glenn, try to set him up with some temporary housing and support and a running line of credit at a restaurant in San Francisco where you can go eat. And eventually, Glenn does end up back living with his sister, Lutha, in Oakland for the final months of his life. And it's a sad but sweet scenes there. Lutha was terrific with me, telling stories about what that period was like, where she would just sit at the foot of Glenn's bed and rub his feet. And he was in so much pain, he could barely breathe. She would make his favorite foods for him at a time when he was literally crawling to the bathroom. It's just incredible pain, but incredibly sweet relationship between Lutha and her brother. And she's just trying to make it as comfortable as possible for him. He's kind of rediscovered at this point in his life by the media. There's articles about this former MLB player dying of AIDS. His former teammates start coming by to visit with him or to call him. In some great conversations taking place between these old friends at that point.